After 25 years, police might have cracked this case. Teachers Stan and Denise welcomed their eldest daughter Kristen into the world back in 1977. The couple was in Europe on business. At the time, they were working with the children of servicemen, so Kristen was born in Augsburg, Germany. However, the family moved back to the United States and lived in Stockton, California. According to her parents, Kristen was ambitious and adventurous from a very young age. She was so loving and caring, especially when her little brother and sister came along. Even as a child, she showered her siblings with attention. She was family-oriented and developed a love for travel. She enjoyed planning little trips for her family. The older she got, the more Kristen used her vacation time to get out and see different parts of the world. For example, when she was in high school, she went to Venezuela and sharpened up her Spanish skills. She just loved to experience different cultures. Kristen landed a wonderful job in Hawaii, where she worked as a lifeguard at a camp in 1995, just 1 year before she disappeared. June of that year, Kristen also graduated from Stockton's Lincoln High School, and she was ready for college. She traveled south to San Luis Obispo to attend Cal Poly and begin her college education. She was a beautiful, ambitious student with her whole life ahead of her. Sadly, her dreams and life got cut tragically short. On Friday, May 24, 1996, the country was getting ready to enjoy the Memorial Day weekend. Normally, Kristen would call her parents on Sunday nights, but this time she decided to give them a ring a couple of days early. Her parents weren't home, so Kristen left them a voicemail. What nobody expected was that it was the last time Stan and Denise would hear their daughter's voice. That night, Kristen and her friends wanted to have a night out and looked for a fun party to go to. The social college freshman wanted to go to some venue off campus, but the friend she was out with didn't feel like leaving. She ultimately left her friends a few blocks away from where another student was hosting his birthday party. According to her friends, Kristen didn't touch any alcohol at that point, but other reports stated otherwise. Apparently, some witnesses spotted the young lady drinking vodka throughout the night. However, contradicting claims stated that Kristen was completely sober. Either way, the witness reports from that party were unclear. Whether or not it was at the party, it seems as though at some point Kristen was indeed intoxicated. Two students, Tim Davis and Cheryl Anderson, noticed Kristen at about 2 a.m. She was lying down completely passed out in front of the neighboring property. The two of them picked her up and helped her get back to her dorm. They just wanted to help. However, Anderson and Davis didn't get anywhere before Paul Flores joined them. He was another student who lived near Kristen. Later, it was discovered that he was already in trouble with the police because he supposedly tried to break into a woman's apartment. For some reason, law enforcement didn't notify campus police at Cal Poly. Nevertheless, the four of them headed towards the dorms, and Paul picked up Kristen as they walked. When they finally got to campus, Tim left to go to his car, and according to Cheryl, this is when things started to get weird. Supposedly, Paul kept telling her to go away so that he can be left alone with the drunk Kristen. Cheryl and Paul both walked to her dorm and said goodnight to Kristen. After that, nobody knows what happened to the 19-year-old. Paul claimed that he walked with her to his room before going back to her room alone, but Kristen never made it back to her room. Initially, her friends weren't too worried. They were kind of wondering why she didn't show up for breakfast for 2 days in a row, but they thought she was safe. They didn't consider that something might have happened to her. Kristen's roommate, Crystal Calvin, spent the weekend away, and when she got back on May 27th, the real panic was raised. Crystal was confused when she noticed that all of Kristen's things were placed exactly where they were placed when she left on Friday evening. The most concerning part was that no one had any clue where the young college student was. Crystal asked everyone in the dorm if they noticed her around, but no one could remember seeing her in days. Subsequently, Crystal contacted the campus police. Since it was Memorial Day weekend, things were moving slowly. A lot of the students go away for long weekends. The officers figured Kristen was probably one of them. Investigators contacted her mother, who confirmed that Kristen did not come home. That's when they realized they have a missing person on their hands. The next day, a campaign was launched by Kristen's family and friends to help find the missing girl. The police on campus, as well as in San Luis Obispo, began an official investigation. But it was almost a week after the party when they finally started questioning students. Among the students who got interviewed were Cheryl Anderson, Tim Davis, and Paul Flores. At the time of questioning, it was obvious that Paul had a black eye. When detectives asked him how he got it, Paul claimed the injury happened during a basketball game. A teammate later denied this statement. Despite the bizarre circumstances and their strong suspicions, campus authorities never searched Paul's dorm room. The college police admitted defeat weeks later and asked for help from the San Luis Obispo district attorney. As the investigation continued, Paul was looking more and more suspicious. He told different stories about how he obtained the black eye on various occasions. He was also noticeably reluctant to take a polygraph test. The investigation into Kristen's disappearance proceeded, and Paul left San Luis Obispo for the summer to spend time with his parents. Once he was gone, police brought cadaver dogs to search his room. Apparently, the dogs gravitated toward the mattress, in particular, suggesting something terrible might have happened in the Cal Poly dorms. Another piece of strong evidence was found in Arroyo Canyon, about 17 miles from the Cal Poly campus. Reportedly, Paul's parents owned property there, and it was empty at the time Kristen disappeared. But in the past few weeks, a new tenant had already moved in. One day, she found an earring in her driveway. Since she was aware of the link between the home and the missing girl, the tenant gave the abandoned earring to the detectives. Frustratingly, it was mysteriously misplaced. After hearing the description of the earrings, Kristen's mom, Denise, was certain it was her daughter's. No matter how much family pressured the police, this essential piece of evidence was strangely never found. 6 months after Kristen went missing in November 1997, her family accused Paul Flores of wrongful death in court. The suspicious young man continued to deny playing a role in this strange mystery. With no solid evidence, he was never charged, although they never stopped looking for their daughter. 2 years after Kristen's disappearance, her parents made a heartbreaking decision. In May 2002, Stan and Denise legally declared Kristen dead. By that point, a new law came into play, known as the Kristen Smart Campus Security Act. It mandated improved communication between local law enforcement and campus police. Unfortunately, that policy came too late to save Kristen's seemingly botched case. 17 years after the law was introduced, investigators discovered a new lead in the cold case. With the assistance of cadaver dogs, police searched an area located next to Kristen's dorm. Reportedly, several interesting items were found during the search. However, details regarding the results weren't released yet. But in September 2019, Kristen's case returned to the spotlight, thanks to musician Chris Lambert. During an episode of his podcast, Your Own Backyard, Lambert discussed allegations that the missing teenager was buried under the concrete of that home Paul's parents owned. Supposedly, witnesses even heard beeping from the Arroyo Grande property yard, and it was around the same time Kristen's alarm would go off. Lambert also mentioned that there had been a number of reports from women who say they have been assaulted or harassed by Paul. Thanks to the limelight suddenly returning to the case, the potential suspects seemed extremely suspicious. By January 2020, Kristen's family got some unexpected news. It was reported by California newspaper The Record that Denise Smart was told by the FBI that she might want to get away for a while. Apparently, a big break in Kristen's case was about to come to light. Understandably, the family anxiously awaited to hear the news. Is it really possible that this case can finally be closed after all these years? In the January 18th article, Denise stated, "I wish I knew when the break is going to come because it's very anxiety-producing. It's like, can you give me the flight plan? When is this happening?" Just a few days later, a statement was released by Kristen's family that appeared to contradict previous claims. The Smart family clarified that it wasn't the Bureau who reached out to them, it was a retired FBI agent who was a friend of the family. They went on to say that there is no expected announcement related to Kristen's disappearance. It was delayed by authorities. I can only imagine what this poor family has gone through. They already lost their daughter. They just want to know what happened to her. But all of that changed exactly 1 week later. On January 29th, a press conference was issued by the San Luis Obispo County Sheriff's Office, confirming a development in the Kristen Smart case. At this point, detectives supposedly had their hands on 2 trucks that the Flores family owned at the time of Kristen's disappearance. In the press release, law enforcement did acknowledge that they had 2 vehicles in their possession. However, they didn't say how long they have had them for. Still, they explained how since the new sheriff took over the investigation in 2011, there have been developments in the case. According to the police department, throughout the last 9 years, 18 search warrants related to the case were executed. In addition, police claim to have traveled to 9 different areas to look for physical evidence that may lead them to solve this tragic case. At the same time, detectives re-examined all the statements and information that they already had on record. Since technology has significantly improved since the 90s, 37 items and evidence were sent for DNA testing. Officers stated that due to this process, since 2011, they were able to acquire 140 pieces of additional evidence. On top of that, investigators conducted over 90 interviews and documented over 360 new reports. Police estimated that about 7,500 hours and $62,000 were spent on trying to solve this case. In their statement, law enforcement didn't bring up any dramatic revelations, but a big announcement was about to come. The San Luis Obispo County Sheriff's Office released a second public message on February 5th. This time they confirmed that they executed search warrants in 4 different locations in Washington state and California. Understandably, the officers weren't able to release exact locations being investigated. Either way, local news station KCAL TV exposed a new dimension to the story. Supposedly, they were able to get a hold of one of the locations, and the address was a house in San Pedro, California. It happens to be the home of now 43-year-old Paul Flores. Finally, the news station didn't stop there. They went on to report that police detained a guy who matched the suspect's description outside the San Pedro residence. He was led into a police car wearing handcuffs and was eventually released after being held in custody for 2 hours. Meanwhile, investigators made their way to Arroyo Grande, where they stopped by Paul's mother, Susan's home. According to the Tribune, a San Luis Obispo newspaper, detectives used caution tape to seal off the entire property as a small crowd watched. Some people allegedly started screaming, "Dig her up." Perhaps they heard Lambert's podcast. Later on that day, police were seen leaving the house carrying multiple pieces of potential evidence. This included a storage container and a computer. During the late hours of the night, the county sheriff's office spokesman, Tony Capola, released a statement. He confirmed that investigators did, in fact, find some items of interest during that search. During an interview with the New York Times, he added, "We will now analyze those and see how they relate to the case. We would like nothing more than to bring closure to the Smart family in this case." Kristen's family thinks that Lambert's popular podcast played a huge part in the latest developments of the case. Even before February 5th, the Smarts thanked the musician for speaking out about their daughter's case. Your Own Backyard has been instrumental in renewing the interest in Kristen's investigation and generating many new leads. Cipolla pointed out that the police department and law enforcement have always been dedicated to solving the Kristen Smart case. He explained in a statement, "This has always been an active investigation. It has never been a cold case. There is no denying that the investigation did not start off on the right foot. However, investigators seem more motivated than ever to solve the mystery. They put a lot of resources and energy to figure out what happened to Kristen on that fateful night over 2 decades ago. With the recent searches and new evidence, we are praying a resolution is on its way. The grieving Smart family has been wondering where their daughter is for years. We only pray that the truth comes out and they can finally start moving on." Kristen's disappearance was a tough case. She was so young and had her whole life ahead of her. This can happen to any college student. She just wanted a night out, but sadly she never came home. Unfortunately, people go missing way too often, but it's not every day that a girl solves her own kidnapping. When Carolina White was only 19 days old, she was kidnapped from the hospital. Carolina spent her whole life believing that the woman who raised her was her mother, when in fact, she was her kidnapper. When she was a young adult, she was finally reunited with her real family. This is how Carolina White solved her own missing case. Carolina White was born on July 15, 1987. She grew up being known as Nedra Nettie Nance, and the young woman actually solved her own kidnapping case. When she was 19 days old, she was taken out of the Harlem Hospital Center in New York City, but it wasn't by her mother. For years, the girl was living with and being raised by a woman who she could only believe was her mother, but in fact, it was her kidnapper. Carolina only got to meet her biological parents when she was 23 years, which makes her case the longest known gap in a non-parental abduction in the United States where the victim is reunited with the family. Yes, it's incredible, and yes, it's a story for the movies. In fact, Carolina's story was made into a television movie on Lifetime called Abducted, The Carolina White Story. Nettie Nance, now 33 years old, and it's been 10 years since her story made headlines and she was able to meet her real parents. She too is a parent, and in her words, if it wasn't for me getting pregnant, this would never have come out. What Nettie is referring to is the dramatic discovery she made that completely upended her life. She spent a lot of time and energy both embracing this revelation as well as trying to wish it away. In 2004, when Nettie was a senior in high school, she lived in a poor neighborhood in Bridgeport, Connecticut, when she found out that she was pregnant. By that fall, she couldn't hide it anymore, nor did she want to. She was excited to be a mom. Her cousin, Brittany, was also pregnant, and they spoke about being mothers together. But Nettie needed prenatal care, and to get free services from the state of Connecticut, she had to show her birth certificate, and that's when the story really began. Her father, a man named Robert Nance, was an occasional drug dealer who only saw Nettie from time to time. It was her mother, Ann Petway, who did all the raising and support. But when the time came one day when Nettie asked her mother for her birth certificate, Ann just brushed it off. She said she was going to handle it, Nettie recalled. But Nettie got tired of waiting, so she looked through her mother's things, and she found something. Nettie found a document with her name and birth date on it, and she looked into the Bureau of Vital Statistics in New Haven. The clerk, however, couldn't find her records. Nettie wasn't happy, and when she pressed on, a supervisor even accused her of trying to assume a fake identity. The supervisor told the pregnant teenager that if she kept trying to pass off this document that she has as an ID, she might be arrested. Nettie was furious. "Keep it," she said to the woman, and stormed out of the office. When she got home, she told her mother what happened. Anne just shook her head and said, "I told you I was going to handle everything." Soon after, the Department of Children and Families called looking for Nettie's mother. Nettie wasn't in the know of their conversation. For all she knew, they told her that without proper ID, Nettie needed to enter their system and become a ward of their state. But whatever it was that they spoke about, Anne told Nettie several days later, before she was leaving for work, that she wanted to talk to her when she came home. When Anne came home that evening, she went straight up to Nettie's room, sat down on her bed, and started crying. In her whole life, Nettie never saw her mother shed even one tear. "What are you crying for?" Nettie asked her. "Your mom left you," Anne told her, "and she never came back." It was the first time Nettie was told a lie that completely changed her life. It wasn't until a full 7 years later that Nettie learned the rest of the story. She would eventually learn that her real name was Carolina White and that she was abducted as a newborn, 19 days after her birth, from Harlem Hospital, only to never be seen again. And perhaps most shocking of all was for Nettie to realize that this woman she called Mom wasn't even her mother. Not only was Ann Petway not Nettie's real mother, but according to the police, she was her kidnapper. So who are her real parents? Their names are Joy White and Carl Tyson. And the couple had been the first among their friends to have a baby. The year was 1987. Carl was 22, a trucker who worked nights in a parking garage. Joy was 16 and still in high school. They each grew up in Harlem housing projects nearby one another. They had been dating for a year when Joy called Carl up at work one day, telling him that she felt sick. The pregnancy clearly wasn't planned, but the couple chose to stay together. Their baby girl, Carolina, was born at Harlem Hospital on July 15th and weighed a healthy 8 pounds. Joy had the help of her mother, who took care of the baby at her home. Carl would come by every night after his shift, but on August 4th, when Carolina was just 19 days old, she developed a dangerously high fever. Joy and Carl took the baby back to the hospital that she was born in. As they came in, Carl remembers being directed by a heavy-set black woman who looked to be in her 20s wearing a nurse's uniform. Carl didn't really think twice about it at the time, but he looked for her name tag and couldn't find one. The doctor told the couple that they wanted Carolina to spend the night at the hospital for monitoring, and so Carl searched for a phone so they could call their mothers. When he looked down the hall, he saw the young woman in the nurse's uniform talking with Joy. "The baby doesn't cry for you, you cry for the baby," is what the nurse told Joy. In essence, she was telling Joy that the baby was fine, that it was Joy who needed help. Carl remembers thinking it was a strange way to console a young mother. The couple then left the hospital together at around 12:30 a.m., at the same time as the nurse's shift change. Carl then took Joy to her mother's apartment and he went home and went to sleep. Carl's phone rang at about 6 a.m. It was the police calling from Joy's mother's apartment. A detective told him that Carolina was missing. Joy grabbed the phone and screamed, "Please get here." When Carl got there, police cars were everywhere and detectives crowded the hallways. Little did either of them know that last night was the last time they would see their daughter. Inside the home, Joy was in a state that any mother would be in after hearing such news. She was in pieces, sobbing, and soon Carl was too. The hospital learned that Carolina was gone at 3:40 a.m., and whoever took her unhooked her IV tubes and left without being seen. The hospital claimed, though, that the baby was being checked every 5 minutes. The police believed that the kidnapper knew the hospital routines really well and knew to take Carolina at just the right window of time. They suspected a heavy-set woman whose staff members had seen around the hospital for the last few months. The woman wasn't a nurse, the hospital said, but passed as one, even convincing other nurses that she belonged there. It was the woman Carl noticed right away. Joy remembered that strange remark the woman had told her that night in front of the hospital room. She was trying to get rid of me, Joy later said, so she could take my baby away from me. For a while, police thought they had a suspect, a 31-year-old woman by the name of Lucy Brockington. She was already wanted for car theft and fit the description. Detectives even tracked her down in Baltimore and questioned her, but they ultimately decided that she had an alibi. And unfortunately, after that, they had nothing. There was no sign of the woman nor the baby. Carolina White was gone, and her parents were in shambles. Joy was out of school for a year and had to take anti-anxiety medication to get through the day, also going to therapy several times a week. Carl said he would hardly eat. I was angry with everyone. My temper was short. He would go over that night at the hospital over and over again, asking why Joy didn't just stay at the hospital. He asked himself, why didn't I stay? His presence only reminded Joy of Carolina, as did hers for Carl. It was so much to handle, Carl recalled. They ended up breaking up about a year after Carolina vanished. It would take more than 2 decades, but Carl would later say, I always felt that my daughter was going to come back. I didn't know when, but I knew. Joy was the same way. She always had that feeling. Carl, who's large with bright eyes and caramel skin, has a resemblance to Nettie that is unmistakable. Anne Pettaway grew up in the East End of Bridgeport. She went to Warren Harding High School, the same high school that Nettie would go to. Anne was a popular and fun girl to be around. Everybody said she used to be bad, Nettie said about her. She was out there with those Speedo shorts on, tube tops, and she sure did have a bad streak. As a teenager, Anne served a month in jail for larceny in a nearby town. Later, she would be caught in minor theft and forgery schemes, as well as on one pot bust. But according to David Daniels, a Bridgeport police officer who knew the family, she wasn't a hellraiser. In 1987, the year Nettie was born, Anne told her friends and family that she was pregnant. Everyone figured the father was the boyfriend she had been seeing on and off, a man named Robert Nance. One of Anne's younger sisters, Cassandra Johnson, later told the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children that the first time she saw Anne with a baby was when Anne arrived with the infant one day on a Metro North train. One of Anne's cousins said that Anne left town for a period of time, and it seemed as though no one that Anne knew was with her when the baby was born. She has no witnesses of her giving birth, and considering her weight, they also couldn't tell that she wasn't indeed pregnant. People just assumed that she went away to give birth and came back. For whatever reason, Anne wanted a child and felt that her only option was to take someone else's. Sadly for Joy and Carl, that child was theirs, and Nettie would spend the first 23 years of her life thinking the woman who raised her was her mother. But Anne was far from the ideal mom. In January of 2011, when the story got out of the alleged kidnapping, Nettie told the New York Post all about her mother. She said that Anne was an addict who was often in a drug haze. There were always drugs lying around. I used to see weapons. When Anne came down from one of her highs, Nettie would run out of the house before Anne became a monster again. Nettie came clean with everything that she endured living in a home with this woman. But despite the absolute injustice and heartbreak, Nettie said that she is more forgiving, even saying that everything that happened in her childhood was standard for where she grew up. Growing up in an urban family, she told the interviewer, you were going to get beat, no matter what it was. As sad as the story is, Nettie doesn't like to call it abuse. That's what people want to hear, the sob story. But I wasn't abused. Everything that an average person would have, I had. Believe it or not, she considers Anne as responsible, but remote. Never cruel to her, but not exactly tender either. Despite all the drugs and mood swings, Nettie still had this to say about Anne. I'm not going to say she was the best mom ever, but she did what she had to do to make me who I am. She was strict, but she was cool. All my friends used to say she was a cool mom. Anne did support Nettie, though, by working as a janitor at a local civic center. Until she started high school again, Anne sent Nettie to live with her own mother, Mary, during the weeks. Mary lived in a slightly better part of town, which meant Nettie could go to a better school. Then, when Nettie was about 10 years old, Anne had a baby, a boy named Trevin. Nettie spent a lot of childhood with her cousins and aunts, and was especially close to Anne's sister, Cassandra, who she called her bestie. There was at least one cousin who admitted that people in the family would speculate behind Anne and Nettie's back about the discrepancy about their looks. Anne was dark-skinned, but Nettie was light. Nettie remembers looking at pictures of Anne later on to see if they had any resemblance whatsoever. Everybody called me Little Anne, she said, but I didn't see a resemblance. Anne recalls the moment when Anne confessed to Nettie that she wasn't her mother. My whole stomach just turned up, Nettie said. All these thoughts and questions went through her head, like, what are you saying? What the hell are you talking about? This is not my family? That's not my grandmother downstairs? But let's not forget that Anne told Nettie she was abandoned by her mother, omitting the real truth. But still, Nettie had questions, asking her who her real mother was and where she came from. Had she met her mother, or was she left on the doorstep? But to each question, Anne gave the same answer. She left you and never came back. She insisted that there was nothing more to it. She gave her no names, nothing. For weeks, Nettie would ask her these types of questions, but it always led to a dead end. Even when a year passed by, I was like, you don't remember nothing? No. With time and frustration, they stopped discussing the matter and told no one about it. But Nettie's curiosity never faded. Deep down, she didn't believe that she just fell into Anne's lap. And so, as her suspicions grew, her relationship with Anne grew more distant. Nettie asked the caseworker from the Department of Children and Families if her DNA could be cross-referenced with the DNA database of missing children. But she was told that's TV stuff. Robert Nance, her father, was in jail at the time on a sexual assault charge and called Nettie after an investigator visited him. Nettie took the opportunity to ask him what he knew about her mother. He told her that he and Anne weren't together when she was born. If Nettie wasn't his and Anne's, he told her, then he wouldn't have known. Nettie's daughter, Samani, was born in 2005. Nettie still got her high school diploma and got a job as a motel desk clerk. When Samani turned 1, she moved into her own place, and by 2009 she moved to Atlanta, where her aunt and bestie, Cassandra, moved a few years prior. Nettie then found work in a hair salon, did a little modeling, and still had dreams of being in the music industry. Anne would send cards and gifts to Samani. Eventually, Nettie told Cassandra about her secret, and Cassandra encouraged Nettie to keep searching for her birth mother. Late at night, when Nettie had some alone time, she would find herself searching the internet for stories of missing children. She typed into Google, "Missing Child 1987." But with all of her online searches, she never found anything. Then, in late 2010, Nettie went to the website for the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. There, she found hundreds of pictures of kids from all over the country. Then it dawned on Nettie that she could be from anywhere, not just Bridgeport. She went through the photo archive and saw a picture of a baby girl, a newborn just 19 days old, who went missing on August 4th, 1987. The photo caught her eye, and so she dragged the photo to her desktop to save it. That little baby's face reminded her of her own daughter, and everyone told her that Samani looked just like her. 3 days before Christmas that year in 2010, Nettie called the center's hotline. She muttered the words, "I feel like I don't know who I am," but she didn't mention the photo of the baby. She got overwhelmed at one point and passed the phone to Cassandra, who was with her. She was agitated, the center's president, Ernie Allen, said. She talked about how she'd been trying to get information about her identity for 5 years. My sense was that this was almost a call of desperation. In that call, Nettie revealed her suspicions about Anne. In Ernie Allen's words, she said she believed the woman known to her as her mother abducted her near the time of her birth. Cassandra reminded Nettie of a birthmark she has on her right arm, which was a detail the center used to cross-reference its records of missing children. We ultimately narrowed the search to 2 cases, Allen said, and one of those was Carolina White. The forensic unit compared Nettie's baby photos with the photo of Carolina when she was 19 days old. They appeared to be a match. There was nothing to suggest this was not Carolina, Allen said, and just after Christmas, the center called Joy and Carl. Joy was at work. She got an email with photos of Nettie. She screamed and cried out. Both of them were adamant, saying this was their daughter, Allen recalled. The center then contacted the NYPD's Missing Persons Unit. Before even getting the DNA testing from Nettie, Carl, and Joy, Nettie decided to call Joy. The first conversation ever between this mother and daughter was on speakerphone with all of Joy's sisters. One of the aunts shouted, "Come home!" Nettie had tiny doubts that this wasn't her real family, but once Joy mentioned the birthmark, Nettie was overwhelmed. I said, "Wow, this is real now." Nettie then called Carl, which was more awkward, but she was still happy to connect them. For 2 weeks, Joy and Carl spoke with Nettie often. "We're talking, and all of a sudden, she's calling me Dad," Carl said, and I'm sitting there saying to myself, I can't believe it. This is my daughter. That's my firstborn. And Joy would be trying to call, too, and so she would say, "Dad, Mom's on the phone." And I was like, this girl is calling us Mom and Dad. By January, Joy flew Nettie and Samani, her granddaughter, back to New York to visit them. Joy and her sister came to pick them up, and obviously there were many tears involved. Happy ones, though. All of Joy's extended family were at the house waiting to meet them. Nettie then met her sister and brother, Sheena and Sydney, her aunts, cousins, and a grandmother, Joy's mother, Elizabeth. For the time being, Nettie and Joy didn't talk about Ann Petway or about Nettie's childhood. Instead, they focused on the good things, looked for common traits, cooked together, and watched Samani play. "It felt like this is where I belong," Nettie recalled. The next morning, Carl came to meet Nettie. When Nettie finally met her father, he couldn't stop staring at her. She said, "Do I have something on my face or something?" He said, "No, girl, you don't understand what me and your mother went through. Just to see you standing here is a blessing." A few days later, Nettie and her daughter were at the airport waiting for their plane back to Atlanta. A man came up to her and asked, "Are you Nedra Nance?" He said a detective told him to tell her to call him. He told her they got the DNA back and it came back positive. The NYPD had been trying to reach them, not knowing they were all in New York together. Upon hearing the news, she still boarded her flight back home. The next day, the news broke. Until then, no child in American history had been missing for longer before being reunited with their parents. It was a big story. The Post wanted to fly Nettie to New York and put her up with Carl and Joy at a hotel. Nettie agreed to come, but went without Samani, who stayed with Cassandra. When Nettie arrived at the hotel, the whole media was there. They were booking rooms on the same floor. I couldn't leave the room without someone seeing me. They had to lead me out of the kitchen to leave the hotel. As for Joy, she was ecstatic. "I always dreamed this," she told a reporter. "Now I can sleep." Nettie tried to be happy too, but the attention made her feel uncomfortable. Nettie couldn't stop thinking about Ann and all of this. It wasn't just that Ann lied to her. She was an accused kidnapper now. The FBI was searching for her as she was facing a federal prison sentence of 20 years to life. For a few years now, Ann had been living in Raleigh, North Carolina, apparently working as a kitchen prep cook. When the Post first reached out to Ann, she vowed to make things right. I'm coming back to straighten this all out," she told them. "I raised her, and I was a good mom." But then she up and left the state and disappeared, just like Carolina had 23 years earlier. In New York, Nettie was growing harsh, refusing to look at a police sketch from 1987, or even refer to Ann by her name. "When I look at Joy, I can see me. With that other lady, I would always be searching for stuff we had in common, but I had nothing in common with her." Joy said, "I want her to suffer," referring to Ann. "I want her to do some time like I suffered for 23 years. After Nettie returned to Atlanta, she stopped calling her newly discovered parents as often. The media was really getting to her, causing her to recluse. She even checked into a hotel in Georgia to avoid being seen by reporters at her house, but the calls didn't stop. A few years later, when Nettie was still searching for her real mother, she wrote to the Oprah Winfrey Show, but never heard back. But now a producer from the show was on the phone, reading her letter back to her. Joy said she wanted to do the show, and Carl was fine with it, and Nettie said yes at first, but then changed her mind. The weight of what has happened to Ann and Nettie's role in it started to sink in. She was also worried about her little brother, Trevin. Nettie was lucky enough to have her real new family, but Trevin only had Ann. What would happen to him if she went to jail for the rest of her life? Joy and Carl were disappointed that they wouldn't be doing the Oprah show, and also that Nettie was distancing herself from them. All they wanted was to see her more, but Nettie was steadfast in her choices at this point. Then, on January 23, 2010, Nettie saw Ann on TV arranging her surrender to the FBI in Connecticut. From the beginning, Ann's lawyer, Robert Baum, was trying for a plea deal. He claimed that Ann wasn't the monster that Nettie made her out to be in the press. As for her motives, which were based on statements that Ann had given to the FBI after her surrender, Ann had miscarried during the summer Carolina was born. She was desperate to become a mother. Anne's lawyer said the evidence that Anne kidnapped Carolina is far from conclusive. He suggested that it's possible that someone else took Carolina, but never gave an idea as to who or how Anne would end up with her. Carl went on TV saying he didn't think Anne was sorry. He also appeared on The Early Show saying, "I just got to move forward step by step." Joy, on the other hand, went on Today saying Nettie was actively distancing herself from both her and Carl. "I was on such a high when I first reunited with my daughter, and it really hurts me that it's about money." She was referring to the reports that surfaced of a trust fund. In 1988, a year after Carolina went missing, Carl and Joy sued the city for $100 million. In 1992, they finally reached a settlement of $750,000, which each parent's share later reduced to $162,643. Carl and Joy then agreed to put half of their shares, a total of $162,000, in a trust fund for Carolina, in the case that she would return before her 21st birthday. But in 2008, after no sign of Carolina, the trust was liquidated, and Carl and Joy collected what they put in. "I have 2 other kids," Joy told Today, "and I had to take care of myself and I had to live." According to Joy, Nettie was less interested in reuniting with her real parents now that the trust fund was gone. But Joy also mentioned that she realized that Nettie was indeed attached to Anne and her relatives. Joy's comments left Nettie feeling betrayed. "How dare you go on TV and say something like that?" Nettie asked Joy on the phone after seeing the show. "I never asked y'all for anything." In May, Robert Baum, Anne's lawyer, announced that Carolina White would testify on Anne's behalf if needed. By July, Nettie cut off all contact with Joy and Carl. Anne Petway was then sentenced to 12 years in federal prison. The statements Anne made about miscarrying and wanting a baby so desperately essentially amounted to a confession in the court's eyes. This was not a crime of greed. This was not a crime of vengeance. It was an act of selfishness, a crime of selfishness that inflicted a parent's worst nightmare on a couple, Judge P. Kevin Castell of Federal District Court in Manhattan said. Before sentencing 50-year-old Anne Petway, she apologized to the family and said, "I am here today to right my wrong and ask for forgiveness." Nettie, however, didn't attend the hearing after she chose to distance herself from the case. Joy and Carl made emotional pleas asking for a prolonged prison term. Anne Petway pleaded guilty to 1 count of kidnapping under a plea agreement that carried a sentencing guide of 10 to 12 and a half years. When Nettie was asked if she would want to visit Anne in jail, she made a face. "I don't really know," she said. "I don't like jails, and I don't like hospitals. That's not what I do, and I'm not going to get out of my comfort zone." Nettie also said that she would eventually communicate with Anne again, but it's going to take a little while for that. "So just when I'm ready to, I know that I will. Just not at this moment." The hard part for Nettie is talking about Anne with Samani. "She's very close with my daughter," Nettie admitted. "She did more stuff with her than I think she did with me. She took her trick-or-treating, Christmas, Halloween, school. She provided like a grandmother's supposed to. She doesn't know the story. I just say she's on vacation." Nettie explained that she went off the radar because she needed to get clarity. "I have bills to pay. I have to teach my daughter. I'm trying to build my own career. I can't just sit here and dwell." A friend of Joy's said that Joy is sad and terrified of commenting publicly again, fearful of driving Nettie further away. Carl is enraged. "She says she's got to live her life." "Okay," he tells me, "but you're not spending any time with your family. None at all. You say you don't know us. Fine, we don't know you, but how are you going to get to know us?" I'm frustrated. Nettie is aware of the pain she has caused Carl and Joy. "I did what I did because I felt like when I'm ready to dip back in, it's going to be on a different note. The approach has to be better than it was the first time. It was just too much commotion." A few weeks later, Nettie called both her parents. Her conversation with Carl was short, but she talked to Joy for 3 hours. The trust fund issue, Nettie says, was just a misunderstanding. What put her and Joy at odds was Anne and her sentencing. "I knew they both wanted justice. I would feel the same way if someone did that to my child. But at the same time, I have unconditional feelings for Anne." All in all, Nettie is happy. She knows the truth now. So what about the name? Is she going to remain Nedra Nance? "I've been trying to get my paperwork together. When I get my ID and everything, it will say Carolina White. But old habits die hard. When someone asks what her name is, she naturally says Nettie." According to her, Nettie's not what the Petway family gave me or what the White family gave me. It's what I gave myself.